All right. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, Ian. So we're having a conversation this morning in recognition of Neurodiversity Celebration Week, which runs from the 18th to the 24th of March. And we've had sessions over the past couple of days on education and on mental health. But today it's the best one, in my opinion. Plus, I can't give the directors I said that. Because obviously this is my area as well. Neurodiversity at work and the issues surrounding that. And there's actually literally no one better to have this conversation with than our presenter this morning, who is Dr. Ian Iceton, who I've only met, I would say, probably about a month ago, Ian, if so long. Hasn't been that long. So I will allow him to introduce himself and talk a little bit about his work. And then we will have a conversation on the topic, and everyone on the call will have the opportunity to ask questions. All right, so Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and good morning, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity of speaking with you today. As Jeremy says, my name's Ian Iceton. I have spent most of my career as working in HR in the UK for a number of large UK corporate organisations. Towards the end of that career, I've specialised particularly in diversity, and for the last 10 years or so, I've been focused on neurodiversity. And when I started doing that, that was a very new word and a new topic. But in the last 5 and 3 years, it's become much more talked about, and lots of organisations are showing a great deal of interest in this topic. So it's wonderful to be able to talk with you today. As part of that, I did a doctorate, a DBA, which is equivalent to the PhD, but from a business perspective. And I particularly focused on the challenges and opportunities of recruiting autistic individuals into the workplace. And I finished that about 2 years ago, and I've spent the last 2 years now. I'm no longer in full-time employment. I spend most of my time talking about and advocating for neurodiversity in the workplace and encouraging employers to think differently about how they recruit people and how they look after people who are neurodivergent in their workplace. So I'm very happy to talk about those topics with you this morning.
Great. And so, Ian, one of the first challenges we have in our jurisdiction here in Trinidad is that I was very busy in terms of advocating for these sessions and putting out flyers and engaging on social media. And then I had a surprising reaction. A lot of people didn't even know what neurodiversity was. And I was like, oh. So from your perspective and from your background, I would want to start with, what is neurodiversity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not surprised that people don't really know exactly what neurodiversity is, because it is a relatively new word. It is probably only been in use, as I say, at most for 10 years. And for many people, although they might have a little bit of an idea, they might not really know exactly what it is. And actually, in academic terms, there isn't one agreed perfect definition yet. So it is not straightforward. But basically, it's about neurological diversity. It reflects the fact that whilst there is a kind of an accepted neurotypical norm about how people generally act, think, behave, approach work, there is a proportion of people whose brains are wired differently. And there's still a lot of debate as to how big that proportion is, but most people think it's somewhere between 10 and 20% of the population's brains are wired in a very different way, and that they have alternative thinking styles. And within that 10 to 20%, there are some differences and disagreements as to what's typically included, but most people are aware that it includes conditions such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and dyscalculia. There are some others, but those are the ones that are most common. And one of the most fascinating things, and one of the most challenging things, which I'm sure we'll get into in more detail, is that actually all of those conditions have some similarities, but they also have some differences. And even within those conditions, there is a huge amount of diversity. So this is a very complicated topic, both for individuals and for organizations to get their head around.
Yeah, I can definitely see that being an issue. So because our topic is the workplace, how does neurodiversity then present in the workplace?
Um, the way that it presents in the workplace is that people who are neurodivergent might deal with a situation differently from how colleagues or their manager might be expecting. And that can appear in many different ways. It can be in terms of how they behave in a situation or how they react in a situation. So if I give you a couple of examples, some of neurodivergent individuals have a lot of sensory issues that make it very difficult for them to operate in a typical workplace. So they might be significantly affected by bright lights or loud noises, for example, or even certain smells or textures. So if they're in an office situation, perhaps, and they're asked to sit somewhere that's right next to a bright light or next to a crowded corridor, that can make them really, really uncomfortable, much more uncomfortable than a neurotypical person, and affect their performance. On the other hand, it can present itself in the way that someone communicates. So, for example, an autistic person might respond in ways that are not neurotypical in the way that they have a conversation. The classic sort of stereotypical thing is often people talk about not being able to have eye contact because their brain tends to make that they look away when they're thinking. But it might also mean that they have longer pauses between you asking them a question and them answering it, which can be a challenge in an interview. Or it might be that they come across as extremely introverted and very, very difficult for you to get them to respond to something. And sometimes people can perceive that as them being maybe a bit stupid or not understanding something. And it's not that, it's just that their brain is working in a very different way. So it can present in lots of different ways. And that's the challenge for employers, is to realize that it isn't necessarily that somebody is being a problem in work, they're just, their brain is working in a different way.
And to pick up on that point, so as you're speaking, I'm thinking, so in my day-to-day operations, I am a consultant. So I help companies deal with staff issues and workplace policies and so on. And I would assume that sometimes disciplinary issues that may come up in the workplace might actually have a neurodiverse component in it. And
Absolutely,
I can
yes.
see that being an issue, especially in a case where the employer isn't aware or doesn't have any background in this area. So
Yeah.
is there a way, or is there a conversation we can have about how we can look at what is happening in the workplace through the lens of neurodiversity when we're looking at workplace issues?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And in fact, that's how I got started. My very first involvement with neurodiversity was in two separate cases where the company I was working for was looking to sack two different employees, two different circumstances. But in both cases, when I investigated them, they were neurodivergent individuals and they'd fallen out with their manager. And when I investigated, the manager wasn't aware that they were autistic. They'd miscommunicated between each other, and I realized it wasn't the individual's fault. They weren't trying to do something bad, and it wasn't really the manager's fault because they hadn't been trained by the company to look for facets that might be not about attitude or performance, but actually to do with neurodiversity. And therefore, it was the employer's responsibility to do something about it. So I think I spend a lot of time now when I'm talking to companies and to organizations to say, yeah, if you have got performance management issues or disciplinary issues, one of the things is definitely worth thinking about is, is neurodiversity involved? Because my research shows, and I think other research as well, that less than 50% of the people who are neurodivergent have actually told their employer that they are. So you might have people working alongside you or in your team who have got conditions that need to be looked after, but they haven't told you. And that's historically because people are very worried about stereotypes and being biased and being discriminated against. So they keep it a secret, and they might even be embarrassed about it. And so it makes it really difficult for colleagues and line managers. So, almost to answer the question fully, as a company or as an employer, what you want to try and do is create an environment and a culture where people feel more prepared to disclose if they are neurodiverse, and so that you can have an open conversation. And ideally, you want to get to a situation where they can say to their colleagues and to their manager, these are the things that I find difficult, and these are the things you can do to help me. And that managers can understand it, not just think that someone's been a problem person and we just need to get rid of them.
Great. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, of course, I've used the word spectrum deliberately.
Yes.
You have the issue of within the media and even in some articles that neurodiverse people have superpowers. In other words, they are these things that they are exceptionally good at, and that we should actually try to hire them because they'll be really good at this thing. Obviously, there are things that they won't be as good at, and there are so many different TV shows and movies that have focused on this. Where, quick example, I could probably think of in the UK would be like Doc Martin. This is a show that I love.
Yep.
Or even House in the US,
Yes.
for the Good Doctor, where
Yep.
they are really obnoxious, but they're really good at one thing. And I've seen cases where companies are looking, so companies are, I guess, more forward thinking in a sense. But the lens is there's a superpower ability that we want to tap into. What are your views on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I think I have very mixed views on that, because on the one hand, I think it's obviously somewhat helpful that people and organizations are recognizing that neurodivergent individuals are different, and therefore being able to spot that there are some parts of a neurodivergent individual's profile that might give them some capabilities that are particularly valuable in a workplace is starts up as a good thing. But I think there's some real dangers with it, partly because it's a form of stereotype in itself, and because all neurodivergent individuals are different in themselves, not all neurodivergent individuals have the same spiky profile. They don't all have superpowers, and there's a real danger that it's used as a kind of excuse by companies to potentially target a fraction of neurodivergent individuals and ignore those others that present in different ways. And in a way, it can really reinforce some very unhelpful stereotypes about what neurodiversity looks like. So on balance, I really probably don't like the concept of the superpower thing, but I get why companies do it, because when they're starting out, actually as a way to sort of justify to people and maybe to get budget for some things or to get projects approved, it's a kind of sexy way to try and sell it to people that it's a good thing to do. But I think there are a lot of potential issues with it, so I'm a bit reluctant. And that's not to ignore the fact that some neurodivergent individuals do have really spiky profiles that make them very good at some things, at the same time not so good at others. I just think it's dangerous to create this kind of stereotypical process and description when it clearly doesn't apply to everybody.
Right, and just to clarify a point, so you're using the term spiky profile. So just for the benefit of those who are on the call, if you could just explain what that is.
Yeah, so I think it's sort of my way, and I didn't invent it. Other people have used it, but I quite like it because I think it's, for me, perhaps a better way of thinking about how neurodivergent individuals might present in a team or in a workplace than the superpowers one, because the superpower description almost feels like it's you get a neurodivergent person and you're guaranteed to get someone that's going to have something that they're kind of off the charts with in terms of exception. Now, there's a very small percentage of neurodivergent individuals where that's true, but most aren't off the scale of it. But I think almost all neurodivergent individuals do have some elements of their skills and capabilities that typically are stronger than other aspects. And there are some things that the way that their brain works is likely to make them more capable of doing certain jobs within a workplace. But that will be different between individuals. And at the same time, there will be other facets of their profile that will be less strong than a neurotypical one. So at the same time, if you almost think about it as a graph, I almost think of it an up and down graph. There will be some up bits where they are strong, and there are some down bits where they're not so strong. And if the kind of neurotypical is in the middle, they'll have some that's above and some that's below. And therefore, when you talk about, the characters like House and like Doc Martin, in those cases, they've got diagnostic skills that are really high and they're valued for it, but their intercommunication skills is poor. And they don't care about what people think about them. They use language that is considered very blunt and rude, and for them that's an irrelevancy, and that's a down bit compared to the neurotypical. Now, it's not saying that one's better or one's worse, but that's the difference as to how they might be perceived compared to the neurotypical norm. And it's quite interesting because that norm is just based on what society has created as a typical thing. There is you can't kind of measure, kind of grumpiness and not grumpiness, or rudeness and not rudeness. It's just almost what's become socially acceptable. And I mean, I give you a couple of examples. There was an autistic young gentleman that I was mentoring who got turned down at a job interview. And when he asked for feedback afterwards, they said one of the questions that he answered really badly was one of the questions where he was asked, "What will you be doing in 5 years' time?" And his answer was, "I have no idea what I'll be doing in 5 years' time. That's a really stupid question. The world is in so much turmoil. Technology is progressing so quickly. How can anybody possibly know what they're doing in 5 years' time?" And they said to him that was a bad answer. But in reality, what he said was actually technically correct. But what they meant was although when they asked the question about what were you doing in 5 years' time, they didn't really mean what was he doing in 5 years' time. They were using that as a code for, what's your career ambitions? Do you plan to stay with us? Do you plan to, train and develop? But that's the social expectation, the social norm of what that question means. But he was autistic and he didn't see that. He just took it literally, which is one of his facets, and answered it literally. So he was seen as giving a really poor answer and being rude and blunt, but actually he gave what was really a correct answer.
Yeah, that's a really, really strong point. Now, I wanted to have a conversation around adjustments in the workplace. So from some of the readings I've done, one of the concepts around neurodiversity at work is this thing about accommodations. And this is what I think a lot of employers have issue. And it could literally become $1 million question. So the question is it expected that an employer should make all adjustments needed for a neurodiverse employee?
No. I don't think any employer can ever be expected to make all adjustments that any employee, neurodiverse or not, might ask. But certainly, and the actual legal requirements are different actually by country and by legislation. But certainly in the UK, it's covered in the UK by the Disability Act, which says that employers should make reasonable adjustments. And reasonable is not something that's defined precisely, but it's one of those things with my HR hat on that I think both an employer and an employee can usually both see what's considered reasonable and what's not. So, for example, if somebody, as part of, maybe they're dyslexic and they need a bit of software adding to their computer that allows them to change the color of the screen, the font size, and a few other things, the contrast, so that it makes it much easier for them to be able to access information. Now, Microsoft have a package that does that for you that costs literally a couple of £100, and that can change someone's life if they're dyslexic. And therefore, I would argue if somebody asks for that would strike me as a fairly reasonable thing to ask for. If somebody's really averse to very bright lights or really loud noise, and they're currently sat next to the light and next to the corridor, and there's an open desk, 12 feet away that's empty, and they want to go and sit in that one, that strikes us quite reasonable. However, I was working for one organization that wanted me to look at their reasonable adjustments, and one employee said that he couldn't work in a place where there was any other employees and he needed his own space. And they said, well, actually, that's just unreasonable. You know, you can work from home sometimes, but when you're in the office, we can't say nobody else is allowed in. So I think, you know, there is an element of common sense and sensibleness required. So it doesn't mean that everything somebody asks for, you should give, but there's probably a lot of things that are often cheaper and easier to achieve than an employer might fear it would be if you do a bit of research. So normally accommodations can be achieved that will give a big advantage to people without it being prohibitively expensive.
Great. So that brings me to the concept of neuro-inclusivity at work. So my view is, and from the foundation's view, is that accommodations or adjustments that are made for the neurodiverse population actually benefit everyone. So it's not as though I'm creating a special class or I'm treating anyone in a particular way that is different. In making things more accessible for neurodiverse individuals, it actually helps everyone. So if we use recruitment as an example, what are a couple of the things that an employer could do that are neuro-inclusive? So one of the examples, tying it to what you said before, was that question that I think everybody on this call has either asked or have been asked to answer. That might be a question. What are some of the things an employer could do in a recruitment scenario that suits with us?
I think there's a few things that can be done that would particularly benefit neurodivergent individuals, but would absolutely be a benefit for everybody. We all get nervous when we go in for a job interview. We perhaps don't know where we're going. We don't know what building we're going to. We might not know who we're looking for. If with your invite to an interview, you actually provided a really nice little map that showed where you've got to go, and maybe did a diagram or a photograph of the front of the building. And I've even seen really clever organizations do a photograph of reception and actually say, this is the person that you're looking for when you come in. And they might do a photograph of the person they're going to be interviewed by. And they might even, like you did with me, send me in advance the first 2 or 3 questions that you're going to ask in the interview. Not necessarily all of them. You might not have decided. If you give them the first 2 or 3 in advance, it allows the person to think about and how they'll prepare for that first couple of questions so that they can put themselves at ease and get into the interview process. You could do that for everyone, and everyone would be better off, but I think that would be very helpful. I think the other thing you can do is, and again, it's particularly helpful for neurodivergent individuals, but would help everyone. You could, put something in all your recruitment materials, anything that you advertise, any invites to interviews, and say, we want to be neuro-inclusive. If there's any particular things that we need to be aware of that would make it easier for you to give of your best in an interview, it might be sensory, it might be light, it might be something else, then please let us know in advance and we'll do our very best. We can't guarantee everything, but we'll do our very best to be accommodating. Sometimes I've seen situations, I've done a lot of interviews in my career where the line manager that I'm supporting hasn't read their CV, doesn't know what room we're going into, hasn't looked at the layout in the room, and brings the candidate in, and then kind of there's a faff around where they're sitting them down, and they put them right next to a bright light, and maybe the room's too hot or too cold. You can just prepare things so that the environment is more receptive and conducive to a good conversation that would benefit everyone, but would particularly benefit some people more than others. And I'll give you one other example, which is as much to do with your previous question as this one, but just to sort of bring alive some of the challenges. One of the neurodivergent individuals that I interviewed during my doctoral research explained that the sensory issue that they have most challenging with is certain sounds. And he said the sound of someone biting into a crunchy apple is painful for them to hear. It actually feels to them like he's been hit over the head with a hammer. He said, that's how painful it is if I hear someone crunch into an apple. Now, he says, if I came into your office and said to you, Jeremy, is it okay if I hit you over the head with a hammer? You'd look at him and sort of say, what are you on, man? This is crazy. But he said, nobody ever stops to ask me whether it's okay if they bite into an apple. But that's how painful it is. So whilst that's quite an extreme example, and an unexpected example, it sort of shows that as an employer, if you want to be inclusive, you can ask questions of people to say, what are the things that might be a challenge for them?
That's great. So now the last point I would want to talk about is, should companies develop neuro-inclusive policies or policies specific to neurodiversity? And I'm asking this in the context of what I would like to call the fad culture. In organizational life, there are things that are on trend or that become really important and then they disappear. So in the past, it was leadership, we had strategy, wellness. Now, neurodiversity is a thing that we're talking about. And for some reason, we tend to focus on it. And then a couple of years later, when the new fad comes along, we tend to move along. Does it make
Yeah.
sense for us to create specific policies for neurodiversity? And I think I'm going to answer the question myself. Or create a more inclusive environment across all our policies?
Yes, I think in starting to answer the question yourself, I would agree with you. I think as you said a bit earlier in this conversation, in almost every case, the things that you might do to be inclusive for neurodivergent individuals almost always benefit other people as well. So in that sense, being neuro-inclusive, I just think is a sensible thing to do. Having said that, I do think that we're at a very interesting point in the understanding of the workplace. I think there have always been neurodivergent individuals throughout history, but diagnostics has been very poor, and many people have gone undiagnosed throughout their whole lives and their whole careers and throughout history. In particular, for example, many women who are neurodivergent have gone undiagnosed because the condition for a long time was assumed to be mostly male orientated, and only now are we getting much better at spotting it in women, and also quite interestingly in different cultures. So I don't know what it's like in Trinidad and Tobago, but in the UK, historically it's been also seen as predominantly a condition that was more likely to occur amongst white population than black or other ethnic societies and cultures. And therefore, within other societies and cultures, there were less role models, it was less talked about, and black kids were much less likely to get diagnosed younger, and they were more likely, therefore, for their education to be affected. So I think whilst we want to be neuro-inclusive, of course, for everyone, I think because diagnostics have been poor, I think if we particularly focus on being particularly inclusive of neurodivergence right now, I think there's big bunches of society, a lot of people in the community who will really benefit it for the future. And therefore, I think it's a very important thing that we don't just make a fad and skim over and forget about in a year or two's time, because these people are here forever. And we want them to have rich and fulfilling lives and rich and fulfilling careers. And if we forget about their needs in the workplace, it will be a real disadvantage.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause the recording and I'm going to open the floor for those on the call who would like to ask Dr. Ian any questions related to this topic.